Alrighty, beautiful people, it's your boy Morgan coming at you with another high fantasy podcast author interview. Today, we have Miss Noelle Nichols. Noelle is the author of Shadow's Hand, the first book in the Shadows Creed saga. I was big into the Assassin's Creed games when I was younger, and anything that has Creed in it sounds badass, and this book series sounds just that. Badass. She first began writing the Shadows Creed series in high school, no less. Noelle is a self-described dreamer and lives in the beautiful mountains of Colorado, USA. Shalini and I had a really fun time speaking with Noelle. She's a very independent author and has a lot to say about self-publishing and the like, and we hope you enjoy our conversation as much as we did. Cheers. Alrighty, folks, thank you for tuning in to another author interview. Today we've got Miss Noelle Nichols. Noelle, thank you for coming on to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to chat with you guys.
Alrighty, so Noelle, please describe yourself a little bit and your work, and also about your book, Shadow's Hand.
Yeah, so Shadow's Hand is, first and foremost, it's kind of like an experience. I like to think of it as you're on this journey with the two characters, and it's kind of, you get from it what you kind of put into it. Like, your experiences very much will tell. It'll reflect on how Shadow's Hand is, like, depending on if you agree with what the main character, he's very judging as he goes through his world. It's basically about, like characters who are trying to be their best selves as they are experiencing change around them. They're discovering this new power, which is called the skills, like magic, and they've never seen it before. So they're really just, exploring the world and figuring out things as they go along. So it's something that I like doing, is writing, like moral choice. So it's very heavy on, is this right, is this wrong, and there's no real answer to it. So I think that's kind of engaging because, you might not agree with the main character and you might not agree with what's going forward. So that is Shadow's Hand in a little bit of a sum up narration.
Interestingly enough, Noelle, like the last several people that we've spoken with, we noticed that's kind of a common theme where there's a lot of gray areas when it comes to the characters and the choices that they make. It's no longer like the Tolkien-esque kind of fantasy where good and evil are very, very clear-cut and put into the story quite deliberately like that. There's a lot more imperfect characters with varying degrees of morality and that kind of stuff. So,
Was that something that, it seems like Shadow's Hand has a lot to do with morality. So you mentioned that, or at least in the book blurb, there's a mention to Japanese sort of culture, and it's based on samurai warriors and their strict sort of moral code of the Bushido. And you also mentioned in your website biography that in fantasy you like finding characters that have the strength and hope for a better tomorrow, one that can be more fantastical and beyond reality. So is fantasy now a genre that can best explore morality and humanity's potential in sort of being the best moral self?
I would say fantasy is I think it's one of the best genres, just because I think when you're reading a fantasy book you're looking for something different. You're maybe not really wanting real life experience. You're wanting to dream a little bit and to kind of think about things in a different way. And it's something that, it's fun being a fantasy author because you can take, like these really big ideas and you can kind of put them to an epic scale. And it's different than, if you would just think of, somebody's at a hospital, even, like they're on the deathbed. That's different if you take that same scenario and put it into a world where, there is magic. There's this deep belief that, there's maybe a parallel world. Maybe there's like an afterlife. Maybe there's like, reincarnation, stuff like that. So you get to kind of play with these ideas in a different way, because it's not really reality, but it's also not true. So it gives you kind of like a playground to, like, I like using it to figure out things that I think in the world. Like, I like to play around with ideas of, like, why would this person do something? And then, it's just still like a playground. So I like that aspect of fantasy, and that's kind of why I always read fantasy, and definitely why I probably will always write fantasy.
Yeah, it's again, like, another common theme is it's a really great tool for self-reflection in fantasy for whatever reason. And I think like you've touched on a few of them, but there's something to it where there's that added depth that you might not get out of different genres, like say like a mystery novel or like a horror type novel. I think there's something to be said about it's mimicking real life, but there's so many symbols and there's so many deeper, and because of there's magic and otherworldly stuff like you've mentioned, there's that capacity to have like a really enhanced, exaggerated version of like our world, and then we get to kind of use characters as like representatives of ourselves or other types of people, like archetypes and stuff. So
you just like you touched on everything from the documentary we watched yesterday. So I don't know.
I was gonna bring that up actually.
You used all the keywords. So I don't know if you know much about tarot cards or are interested in tarot cards, but so but what you just said kind of brought up a lot, like a little ding of like the journey that you go through with tarot cards. So for us, we're not like super spiritual or new agey. Really, we just got the tarot cards because they were Hobbit themed, and I just wanted to put them up. But now we're actually interested in sort of the usage of it in terms of like meditation or self-reflection. So we were talking about how so we watched a documentary with Christopher Lee narrating it, so that was pretty awesome. And we were talking about how the Fool's journey through the different cards kind of represent different moral stages or aspects of a journey to enlightenment. So I guess fantasy is also embedded in the tarot cards, and even though tarot is seen as something really universal, it's kind of like fantasy in that way. Where, yeah. There's these symbols, but they always fit into some sort of aspect in your life.
Yeah. Well, it makes sense because they were able to take the story of the Hobbit and then make that the theme of this tarot card pack, and it fits perfectly because it's like the little Hobbit Bilbo is the fool, like the not fool as in foolish or silly, but like someone who doesn't really someone who's very immature and innocent in terms of their moral development. I guess kind of like a child, like someone who's not really been exposed to very much of like the broad range of the world, and then goes on the perilous journey and is confronted with temptations and different dangers, and there's lots of moments for self-reflection and growth. And then he comes to like the mountain, like the big pillar of chaos, and then fights the dragon. Who's like supposed to be the devil and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Overcomes it. Yeah, but I guess the overarching message is it's both, you experience so much that's positive and negative, and that kind of is what characterizes life and the cycle of moral development, because it's not just one way or the other. It's kind of it's a mix of both, and I think yeah.
Is that something you think about in terms of character arc and the journey as well, like the positives and the negatives that the characters face?
Yeah, I definitely feel like I found, like when I first started writing, I knew the characters, like I had a name on the page, and then through writing them, I kind of discovered like who they were as characters, and it was really fun when I put them with other characters who had different views. So, that they would have an experience where they would have something happen to them, and then somebody else would wonder why, they would see it that way. And I just found that fascinating that, you grow more from meeting other people and even being challenged to see things differently. And that's something that I think has really helped characterize my characters, is just not putting them together with a bunch of people that are like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea, let's all do that, as opposed to, maybe we should think about this for a second, because maybe there was like circumstances that kind of, led you to be who you are. Maybe something was pushing you to do it. It's very interesting digging to that deep level, and I find it fun to explore. And I like the interaction between characters that make characters better, and then there are others that make them worse. And so that kind of play is something that's always in the back of my mind, because I'm always like, well, how is this character going to change the story? Because it really depends on who they meet at what time, so that's always something that's fun to play with.
Yeah, so are you kind of a gardener or an architect in terms of the way you write? Do you just let your characters meet each other by happenstance and then see where the plot goes?
Yeah, I would say I would call it more discovery writing, which I guess is the same thing, as the gardener. It's basically, I don't plot because I can't, my brain just doesn't work like that. I feel like I'm very much like, the sculptor discovering, the sculpture in the clay, as opposed to me trying to force my characters to do things, because I feel like that makes me not do something that may be true to them, or something that I even, first impression of, oh, let's do this. And I'm like, wait, it would be way much cooler and easier and maybe different if, you kind of just think about what could possibly happen. And I found almost every single time that things are much better when I just let them happen and I just let the characters evolve, as opposed to me thinking, oh, this is going to happen. And I was like, yeah, that did not happen. And I like this one better anyways.
Yeah, there is something to be said about just things just growing out of the past stuff that's happened, and it's kind of like mimicking life, right? You don't really know where things are going and who you're going to meet. I guess as an author you kind of have that omniscient overlook, but it's always nice to just mimic real life instead.
Yeah. Okay, and so Noelle, what inspired the Japanese mythology premise of your series? This is something that's really interesting to us.
So I've always, been super interested, I don't know why, in Japanese culture. From a very young age, I've always been fascinated by samurai. Specifically, I liked that code. I love how Japanese it is to kind of, dedicate yourself to one purpose. That's kind of the part that fascinates me, because the main culture in Shadow's Hand is kind of a fusion between samurai and shinobi, so they're kind of like ninja samurais, and then their culture grew out of that. But I just feel like this connection to they're dedicating their life to something, and then that very holistic sense that, we let things be as they are. It's a very, the belief that things are part of each other. So the magic system is very organic, very connected to nature, and everything kind of is tied to one another. I just find that fascinating, and I find it to be true in so many ways. So I wanted to create something like a story where the characters could confront this, because, you're dropped into this story where they don't know what's happening. This is all very new to them as well. So they're kind of digging into it, and they're learning about it, and they're discovering things. And so I think that's more of an active way to tell it than, where I know what's happening, because again, they're we're kind of scared of this new power. Mm-hmm. Some people are going to use it a different way. So I drew a lot of inspiration from just my passion about it. Samurai historically, were very deadly warriors, but I decided to take, that passion about dedicating your life, being loyal and wanting to protect the weak, and then added in, a magic sense to where they're figuring it out instead of, I'm telling you how it is. It's it's an experience. And I like that. It's always engaging philosophy and Eastern philosophy. It's more about what you put into it and what you take from it than it is, this is how it is,
Right. So speaking of universality and morality, so what do you think readers are taking away in terms of moral stances, without spoiling the book or anything, by setting it in a sort of Japanese-inspired culture?
So I would say, as my main character, Kilo, he is kind of the champion of people. And I really like that about him, because he's always going to try to do what's best for the people that he serves, which again is the samurai to serve is what it means. So, he's a different kind of leader, because he's trying to do what's best, and he's actually thinking about it, as opposed to, I can't fail, I have to do it this way. It's maybe we try something and it fails, and maybe I was wrong. So it's a very different approach, I think, to a main character.
So these are quite heavy topics, I guess, and talking about morals and philosophy and things like that. But you did mention that, so you actually started writing the Shadows Creed saga in high school. So this is quite a lot to think about back then.
So back in high school, man, this story was completely different, which is bizarre to me to even think about what it was 10 years ago, because I still have the drafts. They're really bad. But yeah, it was such a different story. And like, I had the core. What remained like 10 years ago was I had the culture. I kind of had like the system of, there's the shadows and they're led by the phantom. That remained. And then they had like the, the bond on their arm, which, is kind of like a symbol of them being shadows. But it didn't have like depth to it. And I always felt that I was more of I feel like I'm an old soul trapped in like a younger body. Like I was way more mature in high school than everybody else was. So I felt like I did have all these like overthinking things, but not really. Like I thought more on the deeper level than the surface level. So it's interesting to see how it's grown, because it would not have been the story it would have been in high school. Like it definitely would have been one of those fantasy stories that didn't have like a culture, like a base, like the meat of the story would not have been there. And it totally was more based kind of like on super cartoony anime stuff. And I was like, it's like, yeah, I'm really glad I didn't write that, because I way enjoy, like, I really am proud of this story. I think it's got a lot of good, like guts to it, as opposed to, maybe 18-year-old Noelle didn't know what story was.
Yeah. So is that how you reached the conclusion of just stopping at that age and taking some more time to live and gain that life experience before going back to it? Because that seems like a very mature decision to come to at that age. So
originally, like, I was actually writing this story in English class. I had shown it to my English teacher. It was like an assignment, creative writing, write whatever you want. So I turned in a chapter of the book I had been writing on, and he was super into it, and I was really excited because he really liked it. So he's like, take the rest of the semester to work on writing this book. And then we had, critiques from other students. So, what do you do? What happens when you give, like, another high school student, like this really meaningful piece? So you can imagine. It was a little disheartening because they made a comment about it not seeming real, because it was a chapter about, oh my gosh, it was a chapter about, like somebody falling in love before. And, I was more interested in books than I was in boys at the time. So I kind of realized, I'm like, man, she feels like it's fake. Like, I haven't experienced this, which I hadn't. So then that got me thinking. I was like, okay, I really want to, like, write a story that shares an experience. But then I was like, I haven't really experienced anything. I've read books, but I haven't, like, done anything scary. Like, I haven't lost anyone. So I kind of shelved it for a while, and I'm glad I did, but it kind of sucks because I could have written it, sooner. But I'm pretty happy with how things turned out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you're not alone with saying that you were like an awkward teenager in high school. So that is not. You don't have to feel bad. Because I when I was in I tried writing a couple little like short stories for fun, and they were just so garbage, because at that age, like, I was just so like inexperienced, and also, resentful, not very emotionally mature, and I was mainly writing it just for me, and I didn't really think about what I'm trying to do with it. Like, am I trying to communicate my feelings and ideas here, or am I just kind of writing it because it's something that I would want to read? And there's, the part of that can be a very good thing, but I find it's a lot easier now at 24 and I've had some measure of like life experience outside of being in an institution like a school for my entire life. It's much easier now to actually put pen to paper. It's also influenced heavily by what I've been reading recently. And that's something I wanted to ask you, Noelle. Like, when you were at that age, what kind of material were you also reading that was influencing you at that time? Like, you mentioned anime. I could definitely see that. I had tons of that when I was younger.
So I always liked Robin Hobb. She is still one of my all-time favorite fantasy authors. I just loved her style. And she was like, her and Carol Berg were two of the biggest writers that I was reading that wrote in first-person point of view. Because I feel like, you know, like 10 years ago or so, it was mostly third person. So I thought it was interesting having like that deep connection to like the character in first person. So that was definitely an inspiration to me, because I was like, oh, this feels very natural, you know, experiencing and telling a story in first person. I loved the way, man, she is so good at describing the characters and just like the setting. I read Tolkien, and it's like I'm not a super fan of his work. I know that's super unpopular to say, but to me, his stuff reads more like a history book as opposed to like, you know, I really like that experience and characterization. And like, I totally suffered through the Silmarillion. Like, I forced myself to read that. I don't know why.
Yeah,
it's like,
didn't have to
why does one character have 30 different names? I was like, how am I supposed to like keep track of this? So I knew I didn't like that. I was like, I liked it, you know, in the sense that, you know, it's a big scope and there's a lot going on. It's like, I wasn't a fan of the writing. It's funny enough, like I didn't watch a bunch of anime or read a bunch of manga until a little bit later. And one of the big series, I don't know if you guys are big fans of Rurouni Kenshin. That was one of the shows that kind of hooked me with the samurai thing, because the main character was part of the revolution. So he used to be somebody who, like, he was called the Manslayer. He used to kill a bunch of people. And then, you know, as the series went on and his, like, history reformed itself, he started protecting the people. And I'm such a sucker for, like, the redemption story. Like, I love a good redemption story. So I was like, oh my gosh, I totally want to write a story about a character who, you know, has done something bad and then wants to, like, be a better person, just because I think that's neat in a story, and I think it's admirable in a person. Like, that's, like, the best thing you can do is to, like, you know, struggle through something and become a great person. So that one is still, I've heard some people are like, hey, this is kind of like Rurouni Kenshin. I'm like, yeah, a little bit. It's like a little bit deeper, but I'm kind of happy that, you know, there's the influence there, but it's enough of it's a different story that I think it's more fantasy combined with, you know, like maybe the anime story-ish thing.
Yeah.
I know, that's really awesome. And I see what you mean about your book being an experience then, because the story arc of someone who is a redeeming character or a redemptive sort of story arc is about the experience of the audience member or the reader, right? It's like, oh, I hate this guy, or like, I really don't like agree with what they're saying or doing, and then you kind of see them growing slowly, and it's sort of the satisfaction of seeing that kind of happen throughout the pages. That's really satisfying. And I agree, I totally like those kind of redemptive arcs. One of my biggest sort of wishes for Harry Potter was, I wish Draco Malfoy had like a better redemptive story arc, you know? I wish he could have done something at the end, you know? He was kind of set up to be that way, but I guess to have it more realistic, Rowling just kind of let him go, and you're not really sure about where his loyalties lie at the end.
Yeah, I don't know. It's something that always is kind of difficult, is the unanswered questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Noelle, did you ever watch or read Death Note?
Oh, yeah. It's a great series.
Yeah.
It's like Morgan's favorite anime.
Yeah, I think I've watched it probably 10 times. I first watched it in elementary school, and then I watched it a couple more times through high school, and I watched it through university, and now we just watched it, for me, like the first time in like 4 or 5 years, but we both watched it together in full, and it's just so interesting how what I think about the story and the characters at this age compared to when I was first watching it. You know, the story hasn't changed, but what we make of it has. You're able to recognize that, you know, maybe I don't have all the tools that I need to write the story now, and so you wait until later, and it becomes like, and you said like you're very satisfied with it, which is like fantastic. So, yeah, Death Note. Yes.
Do you find that the hardest aspects of writing have continued on, though? Like, do you still find that what you came up with in high school as an obstacle is still an obstacle for you today in writing?
I would say the biggest part is just keeping track of everything, because originally it was only supposed to be like one character, and then it ended up being two characters, like two different points of view that I have to balance, and then things spiraled out of control from there. It's like the more I was, so you gotta be kidding me, like I was writing this story and it was super straightforward, and then all of a sudden I'm like, well, why do they do that thing? And then, it was like, great, now I have more backstory to weave in, more history, more characters, because I need to have somebody who agrees and somebody who disagrees. So it's definitely keeping track of everything, which is also, funny enough, probably the most fun part, is that, it started out this small little thing and then it blows up into something that's like way bigger than I would have ever imagined possible. So that's hard. And even just trying to get my point across, in the sense that I'm not trying to tell you like how to perceive something, but I'm trying to present enough information for you to kind of, take away what you want from it. That's harder than just being like, this person killed that person. It's more like, hey, this person's dead. Why are they dead? What happened? Kind of thing.
Yeah. That actually segues into one of our questions really well. So one of your beta readers gave you a really good review on Amazon. And they really enjoyed it. And they mentioned that the skills, which is a mysterious type of power in your book, the fluid magic connects the world, the present world with the past, revealing the history and the truth without info dumping. So info dumping is a big no-no and probably a big obstacle for a lot of fantasy writers, especially at the beginning, because you have this big world that you want to convey to the reader and all these different aspects to it. So how do you kind of avoid info dumping in your fantasy writing, or how do you meld it into other aspects like action or what have you, to make it a bit more palatable for readers?
So one of my biggest pet peeves is the info dump. So that probably helps, because this is one of the things I hate about Tolkien is info dumping. It's like, oh my gosh, like I don't want to wade through like 5 or like even 70 pages where he like diverts to like the right field, and you're like, can we get back to the story about the ring and Frodo and not like follow the history of this? So since I hate that so much, like I made sure that I did not do that. Like, you don't need to know all that stuff to me. Like, I don't need to know your 10-page backstory about this character. Like, I just want to know the information I need to get into the story. And I find it more engaging. Like, I always loved it when I would get dropped into a book, like, and I knew nothing. Like, they're just, throwing out terms and they're throwing out things. And, once you start reading it, you're like, okay, I sort of get what they're saying here. So it's more fun, I think. I think of kind of withholding information as more fun than it is to tell you about things, because then it's more of like a game as opposed to, I'm going to tell you everything. It's going to be like, no, I'm not going to tell you everything. I'm going to withhold information. And I'm hoping it's like a play between frustrating the reader because they want to know more, and me kind of giving you enough that you want to keep reading. So I think of it more as a game and not really, let me just dump 10 pages so you understand my story.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting balance in fantasy, because you're right, there is that balance of keeping them interested but also having them want more. And maybe this is a difference in formula throughout society, because or history rather, because Tolkien his intention was to create a mythology and a history, so that's why the books are just info dumping. Essentially, but now we have a different sort of idea for fantasy, where it's not just, oh, look at this world, but oh, look at these characters and how they deal with the impossible conflicts and consequences of their situations.
Yeah, or you could write like the Song of Ice and Fire series, and then the entire thing is kind of like one giant info dump, because it's so impossibly big and huge, and every book is the size of a Bible, that you don't really have to worry about that, because it's always going to be too much regardless of how thin you spread anything. you know, so.
Yeah, depends on how rich your world is.
Yeah.
Well, with George R. R. Martin, he's written, like, encyclopedias now of, like, of his world, which is just wild.
They're just impossibly huge. Yeah.
Would you ever do that with your writing? Like, do you think that that's something you might be interested in, like, exploring the world as opposed to the characters?
Like, I sort of have, like, on the side, I've kind of been developing. It's kind of more, I would say, like, a manual, kind of. Like, you know, you would get with a companion to a video game or something. Like, It's kind of, like, more of a behind-the-scenes way. And I've done, like I'm currently doing, like, a read-along, so I kind of did, like, the behind-the-scenes, you know, here's the inspiration on how this works, and I'll give, like, a little bit of information and background on, you know, what I was trying to achieve, or just even how, like, the culture is set up. But I feel like that's probably saved for a specific type of person. Like, if you really like the story, by all means, like, read it. But I also know it's kind of self-indulgent of the author to be like, read this, and it's like, oh, I just want to know the story and the good stuff. So I mean, it's sort of there. I'll release it eventually, but it's not, I don't think people really would like that as opposed to the story itself.
You'd be surprised, because lore is a pretty big thing for a lot of people. Like, they really like getting into the back. Like, that's one of my things that I like is, like, I'll play a video game, and I want to, and then I'll go on, like, the Wikipedia, if there is, like a wiki for that series, and I'll want to see all the information about, like, the other characters and like the world that it's set in, and it just gives me more context. And I guess it's because I guess I like that just from temperament. I don't know, but yeah. So I would say don't discount that. I will definitely buy it, so you don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, there's definitely enough history nerds and just geeks around. Switching in sort of the technical aspects of publishing. So you are a self-published author, correct? Or an independent author? So I was just really curious. I haven't really talked to a woman who's self-published yet. So have you found your experience different as a female author in comparison to male authors in independent publishing? Because I know that traditional publishing, there's a lot of gateways, and maybe gender is one of them when it comes to fantasy. You mentioned some really amazing female fantasy authors who are traditionally published, but have you found that self-publishing might have those similar obstacles or advantages? Can you speak to any of that?
So from my experience, it's funny because I feel like it's been more in my head than in reality. Like, even just going into the writing community, being kind of like, as the new kid on the block, like, you know, I have one book published and, like, I have another one on the way. But even talking to some people that have published 10, 15 books, it's weird because they're so accepting. And that's, like, bizarre to me, because I feel like we were, like, book nerds growing up, and, you know, we're always, like, you know, the kids snickering in the corner, oh, the book nerd, you know. So it's nice because the writing community is so accepting. There is definitely a place for everybody, especially in the self-publishing community. And I almost feel like that's why I love it even more, because we have the opportunity to hear different voices. Like, every person has a story that they're passionate about, and there are no gatekeepers. You know, the you know, that downside is that there are no gatekeepers, meaning that you have to do, you know, your diligence to produce a quality book. Like, some people just write a book and then they publish it, as opposed to, you know, I'm going to write this book, I'm going to send it to beta readers, I'm going to go through editing, I'm going to go through, like, second round of beta readers, that kind of thing. But yeah, it's seriously all been in my head, because I've been talking to, like, you know, some of the big kids, you know, like, I'm always approaching it that way, and they're like, oh yeah, no, it's like, you know, how do you write? What do you like to write about? And I'm like, they really like me. And it's so bizarre because, you know, I feel like we're scared, because I know some people, even when they self-publish, they'll still use their initials if they're a female, you know, just to try to feel like that was the sneaky way to traditionally publish, you know, female authors, is by their initials. But, like, I've never once felt like I had to be anything other than myself. So I think it's cool that exists, and we're growing as, you know, indie's cool, and and so yeah, I would definitely say it's different than you think it would be.
That's really great to hear. Do you have any other sort of advice for people who do want to self-publish, especially if they're nervous and they don't really know where to start, or if they've started, like how to really approach it?
Be prepared to fail, because you will. Like, somewhere along the journey, and this is kind of like the sad part, is at some point something is not going to work out right. So you kind of have to know how to take it as a learning experience, because I've already had the experience where, you know, when you're self-published, you have to hire editors and proofreaders, and, you know, everyone says they're an editor, in air quotes. But, you know, some people, they'll charge a bunch of money and they don't actually have the skills. So it's kind of you have to be prepared to wear both a business hat, the creative hat, and be these two different people, which is not always fun to be the business person. We all want to write stories, you know, but to be a business person, you know, in order to sell your books and create kind of like a name for yourself, you have to be willing to fail. And it's okay. I've done it. I'm still here. I have survived. And you'd be surprised, again, that people are willing to rally behind you and just offer advice. So, I mean, it's just important to be part of the community and to kind of feel like you're not in it alone, because it's way more fun with other people and you're way more successful.
So, Noelle, where is your favorite place to write? And we ask this because you live in the mountains of Colorado, which at some point I'd like to go, as I hear it's quite beautiful. And do you like to write outside? And like, how does your environment affect your writing and your mood?
My favorite place to write is actually indoors. Disappointing as that is like I have to use my laptop just because, like, I can't write by hand. Like, it's too slow and my wrist just like dies every time I do it. But I do find that there have been a bunch of places that I have gone to that have inspired me. Like, there are direct places I have hiked in Rocky Mountain National Park that are in my book, even though it's like a Japanese feudal setting. Like, I've sneaked in, like, you know, the feeling I felt. Like, there's a cool place in the San Juan Mountains in, like, southern Colorado that is my favorite place in the entire world, because the trees are so big and the mountains are so high. And I have a picture of myself next to this boulder that had fallen down off the mountain, and it is as big as, like, at least one story house, if not two. And I'm just like this teeny tiny person next to it. And I took that feeling of being, like, humbled by this big place inside my fantasy world. So, you know, my main character actually experiences the same thing. Like, this forest feels ancient and deeply rooted and filled with magic, of course. So, you know, I'm inspired in that sense. But I don't like taking my computer outside because it's not fun.
Yeah. I definitely agree that the more that you see of the world, the better you're able to write environments. Like, that's a real thing. Because we both currently live in British Columbia, and we came from Ontario, and it's just the landscape. It's still the same country, right? But it's different in the landscape. The climate's different. You see different types of fauna and plants and animals and stuff, and it reminds you of how diverse the world is in that regard. And yeah, I'd say that it definitely has helped my writing of my thing. I think it probably has for yours too, quite a bit. Yeah. And you have way more international experience than I would, right?
Yeah.
So,
do you have any sort of other writing rituals or things like that?
We've heard coffee is one.
Yeah.
Some people it's alcohol. Some people music.
Yeah. You mentioned that you wake up at 5 a.m. to write every day, which is quite a feat.
Yeah, that's my happy place. It's weird, but it's not, because I'm one of those people that I want to do what I love first thing in the morning. So, you know, everyone's like, man, how do you get up that early? And it's like, I just wake up out of bed and I'm excited, because the first thing I do is I go write my book. Like, I work on my book. So it's not me dreading getting up. It's me, like, super excited. And then it sets up my rest of my day. And I feel like I'm bulletproof because I've already written that day. So it's not like I'm going to come home, you know, after work or something came up and I haven't written, because I've written every day. So that's definitely when I get most of my writing done, which is funny, is at 5 a.m. when I'm sort of half asleep, but not really. So it's interesting, but it works.
Yeah, I've heard some other authors, like, over the years say that that's their preferred time to do it. And they say, like, because you're still kind of in a somewhat dreamlike state, and so they say that has a really great effect on how they write. Like, do you experience that kind of phenomena?
Yeah, it's easier. It feels like the writing zone, which I feel like when I hit, like, the sweet spot, I'm, like, oblivious to everything, and I'm so into my world that I am not conscious of what's going on around me. Sometimes I do wake up, like, pretty awake. Other times I do feel like I'm sort of sleepy, which I know then that, they'll be editing later on because words are going to be skipped and everything. But I find it's a lot easier to kind of really sink into that zone. And especially for me, since I write more stream of conscious, like, I don't, plot or anything, that's really the good sweet spot for me, because it's like, oh, I'm just ready to see what happens. Mm-hmm. So I do feel like that's a fun thing to play with. If you've never tried it, it might be fun.
Yeah, definitely interested in that. And I guess, like, you kind of have to be a gardener to be in that state too, because otherwise, like, for me personally, like, waking up at 5 a.m. and trying to think, like, okay, this is what the plot is, I have to write this chunk and this scene, like, in the morning, I'd be like, no, I can't get up and do that. But instead, like, doing a stream of consciousness and dipping in that way seems like a much better option. Yeah,
not happening. Yeah, I've done the opposite, Noelle, where I try to write, like, about 10 o'clock at night, right before I'm about to pass out. And and I wake up the next morning and realize, oh yes, there's almost no punctuation and I'm missing the words, and we're just gonna redo this entire, like, paragraph all over again. But it's, I think I've tried once or twice to do the early morning, and I've definitely felt that state myself. It's something that where I think it's hard to establish the discipline of getting up, and then I like how it's an interesting kind of philosophy you have where you're getting up and you're doing what you love right away, because like I have a day job and Shalini's in school, and it's like we have to be kind of like, okay, get up, and I have to get ready for that, like that 8-hour part of my day where I'm gonna be engaged with that. And so it's like it's still kind of hard to place what I want to work on right in the morning. And I find it's much easier, like, once I come home and I can unwind, it's like, okay, now I can focus on and, like, enjoy this. But then there's the drawback of me being kind of tired out from the day. So yeah, it's just something that I'm trying to work on. But
So are you working at 5 a.m. every day on the sequel to Shadow's Hand, and do you have anything else planned in the near future?
I am currently going through, like, the final self-edits before I'll send out. The second book is called Phantom's Lament, and it's a little bit bigger than the first book, so I'm personally excited about that. But yeah, no, I've been working on it for the past 2 months solidly at 5 a.m. and then I'll usually work 2 hours in the morning and I'll work about 3 hours in the afternoon. I work around the day job too. And so I'm hoping that's going to be out by the end of August, early September. It's really hard doing a deadline, like scheduling that out as somebody, I don't know if that's everybody, but it's hard to predict. I was like, when am I going to finish? But I think it's important to have that. So I'm trying really hard, and it depends on a lot of things, but I'm excited because the second book is where it gets good.
That's amazing. And it seems like you have a lot of interested fans as well, looking at Amazon as well. So that's really exciting. Do you have any other books or literatures that you're planning to write?
I'm currently working on, it's not really super secret, but I have this aspiration to do a graphic novel of some point. So I have a story. It's not about samurais, sadly. But it's about a traveling merchant, and it's going to be in a fantasy world, but it's going to be sort of more episodic and a little bit more of just having a conversation and solving like little stories. So I think it translates really well to graphic novel. And I'm excited because I like, drawing is kind of a way to unwind from all the very structured editing stuff. So that's kind of on my back burner. I work on it here and there, but I'm trying very hard not to get distracted by the shiny new object.
That's always a problem too. There's this new thing that you want to kind of sink your teeth in.
Yeah, but you're the first person that we've spoken to who is interested in doing that format. And I haven't read a ton of graphic novels, like lots of comic books and manga, anime. But
didn't you used to write graphic novels when you were a kid?
No, like little comic books.
Oh, little comic books.
Yeah. That was about it. Yeah. No, I haven't picked up like a big one. Yeah. So that should be interesting.
Yeah. Are the illustrations on your website, Noelle, illustrations that you've done yourself?
So the map and the cover of Shadow's Hand, those are the ones that I've done myself. The character illustrations are the ones that I had hired someone to do illustrations just because when I was in, the editing phase and self-publishing, I was like, I don't have time to draw, these characters myself. I'm hoping I will, but he did a really good job. So now I'm kind of like, darn, he did too good of a job.
Yeah, just keep those.
That's good. I'll have to hire him again, just he did such a great job.
Well, it's good to delegate some stuff, especially when you're self-publishing. You can't do everything yourself as well, because otherwise you just burn out. But it's great to have illustration as a companion to writing, because I also do some illustrations for my book, and it's a fun way of releasing that creativity.
Yes, it's fun. I think it's awesome when you get to see the artist or the author's rendition of their characters, because it's always a little bit different. So I think that's fun when people kind of try to illustrate their own work and just, explore their story in a different way.
Is there anything additional that you want to remark on? And then also, of course, we want to have you plug where we can find you on social media, your sites, where we can find your books.
Yeah, so I would just say that for my book series specifically, if you are interested in, morality and even a bit of philosophy and just thinking, I feel like that's kind of maybe where the best parts of it is. And I'm going to be a nerd and say if you like samurai and ninja, I do not have enough friends that like samurai and ninja, so I do really like talking to people about my book, and I will nerd out with anybody about any of the deeper meanings and stuff. And, you can find me. I talk back. I talk back on Facebook. I'll message back, and I'm on Twitter, every day, just talking to writers and stuff. So, it's more fun when there's other people, and don't feel free to reach out, because it's fun for the author, and it's kind of one of the best things now to be a reader is even I can contact authors that I like, and I was like, I can have a conversation. This is really cool.
Well, Noelle Nichols, you are a very down-to-earth, very real, and quite wise author. Noelle, it's been really interesting, and I think you explore some really interesting aspects of storytelling and very interesting themes. The format of how you go about writing fantasy, that's something that's very different, very individualistic, which is kind of interesting. But you still acknowledge that you are pretty active in the community, and you rely a lot on others to give you support and feedback, and it's great. And I think it is quite, what you've done is inspirational, and I hope that you have continued success doing that. So thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope to chat with you guys again soon.
Absolutely, yeah,
for sure.
We will.
If you like this episode of our podcast, you can follow us on our social media to get updates on our future episodes. On Facebook, we're at facebook.com/highfantasypodcast. On Instagram, we're at highfantasypodcast. And on Twitter, we're at podcast_fantasy. And don't forget to subscribe here on YouTube as well.